I'm going to show you how to make hot cross buns. These are whole grain made with buckwheat. Now buckwheat is a super scrumptious flour and it can make a really nice, light, fluffy baked good. Before we get to the recipe, I'd like to show you how to make the flour at home. You just put it in the blender, pop the lid on, and press blend. So let's make this recipe. So I'm starting by pouring in 100 grams of buckwheat flour, the store-bought variety for the obvious reason. And I'm also adding about 100 grams of my flour mix that I basically use for everything, especially everything sweet. Next, add 40 grams of tapioca flour. Now if you use the standard flour mix, it has a little bit of tapioca flour in it, so you probably already have it on hand. Bread often needs just a little extra starch because the mix I use is mostly brown rice flour. It's super fine brown rice flour, so it works really well. Next, add your spices. So you can add 1 teaspoon of pumpkin pie spice or mixed British spice, but here I am using about a half a teaspoon of cloves, fennel, and cinnamon, and then salt as well, about a half a teaspoon. So I'm just going to pour those in. And the last dry ingredients are 1.5 teaspoons of psyllium husk powder. Again, that's just a fiber. I use it instead of xanthan gum because it's for most people it's healthier. It's just a fiber. And then yeast. This recipe calls for 1 1/8 teaspoon, so that's about half. That's exactly half of a packet. All right, so I'm gonna give those a whisk. And next you'll add the wet ingredients. Again, you want to whisk this because you don't want any chunks. You don't want any chunks of psyllium husk powder, or it can get lumpy when you add the liquid. And in general, it's a good idea to whisk everything. All right, so now I have 1 cup of water, that's 236 milliliters, and 2 tablespoons of olive oil, that's about 26 grams. So I'm just going to pour that in there, along with 1 large egg, and 2 tablespoons or 30 grams of maple syrup. Now buckwheat again is like a really fine, thirsty flour. It absorbs a lot of water, and so if you have a good recipe for it, it can be super light, and it's also supposed to be, I've heard it's quite healthy. I'm not a nutritionist, but it does have some nutritional value for sure. It does have a stronger flavor compared to some other whole grains, so some people sort of adapt the flavor, other people love it from the get-go, but I definitely like it. It goes really well with spices and nuts and chocolate, generally just strong flavors that help balance it. So you can give this a really good stirring. You don't need to worry about over mixing it. It actually needs to be mixed for at least about a minute. Okay. So lastly, I'm just going to slice up some figs and throw in some almonds. Orange zest also goes really well with this. If you want to do figs and poppy seeds, that's another option. Or you could substitute crystallized ginger and cherries. Now, the thing that's important is that you chop the fruit quite small, because that way you'll make sure that it doesn't all sink to the bottom in your rolls. But this is a really good place where you can also play with flavor without affecting the bake. If you overfill your rolls, you could affect the bake, because the more stuff you have inside of your baked good, the more it will inhibit the rise. So just keep that in mind. If you want to substitute something, I would stick to the grams or the volume that's in the recipe already. So next I use an ice cream scoop. I fill a muffin tin about a little over half full, and keep in mind that you want to leave that extra space because these rolls will at least double in volume, so they'll end up being a little domed on top before they're ready to go into the oven. So these rolls are done rising. As you can see, they are domed, and you can also see some of the dried fruit is on top, so it has held the dried fruit pretty well. So next, they're just going to go into the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 degrees Celsius for about 25 minutes. or until the top starts to brown. Now this is important, and I've talked about it before. Bread needs to brown on the top before it's done baking, and for small portions, when it browns on the top, it's a good indication that it's done or close to done. Now with larger loaves, it's hard to tell because they may need to bake for a lot longer if it's bread that you're baking. All right, so I'm just gonna put an egg wash on these to give them some color on the top. This is not a necessity, but it does give them a little nicer of a bake. The dough itself is really soft, so you just need to be kind of gentle. If you notice, I actually didn't test to see if these were done proofing, and that's because they are so soft. Yeah, so you just want to try to not deflate them as you brush them. But again, it's not something, I don't usually brush them with egg, but if I have time, I might, because they'll give them a slightly nicer look. Buckwheat can be slightly gray. When you're baking with whole grains, you can get kind of a full spectrum of like different browns, like chestnut browns versus like chocolate browns, even into kind of gray browns. So these are ready to go into the oven. So the rolls are done baking. As you can see, there's a nice browning on top and they bounce back. The best way to test whether they're done is actually the toothpick method, and make sure they're a little bit browned on top. Next, I'm going to make the icing sugar for the buns. I'm just mixing together 1.5 cups powdered sugar, that's 160 grams, with 2 tablespoons or about 30 milliliters of water. You might need to add just a little extra water, but you want to see what the consistency is first. So you can see this will sort of drip down, but it's very, very thick. So next you want to fill your pastry bag. I'm just using a plastic one I've had for a while and been reusing, but they do make really nice waxed cloth ones that I also use, and they are quite reusable. So the tip I'm using, as you can see, is one you'd use to make flowers with frosting, but you can use a round tip as well. That's totally fine, and you can even make different designs on these rolls if you'd like. Now I just have the top folded over so it's easier to fill, and then the bottom of it I'm going to twist and then shove inside to keep the frosting from leaking out. Now I didn't add any vanilla to this. You can. It might give it a slightly off-white color, but you can add a little vanilla or a little essence at the end if you like, but just be careful it doesn't add a lot of liquid to the mix that you already have. So before you ice your muffin, you just kind of want to push the frosting down and then twist the top and fold it over. So you can hold it in your hand nicely and pull it out in the bottom as well. You can push it down that way. So next I'm going to show you how to ice one of the rolls. Now traditionally they were iced, the cross on the top was made with dough. But I'm going to use icing sugar. That's what is commonly used now. Some people also use dough. You can use either. The icing sugar just gives it kind of a fancier look and turns it into a sweet roll. But it already has figs and almonds in it, so I think the icing goes really well with it. Now when you ice the bun, you want to hold the piping bag a little bit above it. That way you'll get kind of a straighter line. And the icing will follow the contours of the muffin. You can see some areas where you can see the fig and almonds, and I actually didn't slice them as small as I should have because it does affect the rise. It'll leave some dimples in places, but I think that also gives it a little bit of character. So you have this really nice white frosting on top, and it will set with time. I'm actually going to go ahead and try them. And I think, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but you can make a savory version of these rolls. You can leave the figs and almonds out. I use sunflower seeds and flax seeds, and then I'll put some on top as well. And that makes a really nice sort of savory alternative version. And in that case, then you would either use dough or just not bother with the cross on top. So of course they would not be hot cross buns, but I really like this sweet version and the different variations you can do with dried fruit. Crystallized ginger and dried cranberries are really good in this as well. I usually just use whatever I have on hand, so I'm gonna go ahead and try these. Again, you can see how soft they are. Yeah, these are quite delicious. Yeah, they're really moist. The figs are just bursting with flavor. And I really like the frosting on top. There's not too much, so it's not super sweet. I hope you have fun baking these. Thanks for watching. I'm Rigel Patterson-Frank, and until next time, happy baking. Why isn't this working? So I'm sorry, you might have better luck with it than me. It might be the blender. You know, it's a real shame because like I really believe in using the whole animal, and frankly I don't know how else to consume these.